Again, probably the most famous of our presidential administrations that were named in our country was the administration under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which was known as the New Deal. And it also is kind of the first time that a president really named their administration. And from this point on, each president will have a name for their administration throughout our lectures all the way through next year. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal is simply the name of his administration that was given at the time. And you're going to see a progression of administrative names from this point on. Now, we're talking about the election of 1932. Who's the president? He had a hell of a time with the Depression. Herbert Hoover, okay? And even though he had a bad time during his presidency, the Republicans actually nominated him for president, for re-election. And, you know, the chances were really good for the Democrats to win this election when that happened. So even though he had a tough presidency and was the president during the Depression, during the summer of 1932, the Republicans nominated President Hoover for re-election. The Democrats countered with Franklin D. Roosevelt from New York and a fellow by the name of John Nance Garner of Texas would run as his running mate. Now there's a significance with John Nance Garner that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Okay? This is a signature of John Nance Garner right up there. That's very, very rare, with a picture and a newspaper article that came with it when I purchased it. And I'll tell you how the significance goes a little bit later. Now, obviously, because of the Great Depression, Americans were looking for a new leader for the United States. So, I mean, Hoover never had a chance in this election. It was over from the start. And if you look on your notes, you'll see that Roosevelt and the Democratic Party won a sweeping victory over the Republicans, 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. It was the worst beating that an incumbent president had taken in American history. Usually the incumbent either wins, or if they do lose, it's close. This was a beatdown. 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. Now, the key for Roosevelt's success that will allow him to win 4 terms as president is that the Democratic Party also won both houses of Congress. They won the House and the Senate. And so when you're a president-elect, you're going to get the support you need when you have the same political party running both the House and the Senate. And how Roosevelt's administration got the name the New Deal is President-elect Roosevelt promised the American people a New Deal to pull the nation out of its problems. Okay? So Franklin Roosevelt's going to be our president. Now, before we move on, I want to tell you the John Nance Garner story. The significance of that is Roosevelt had more than one vice president because he served 4 terms. Now, he didn't serve them all, but he was elected to 4. Well, John Nance Garner, the reason he comes up is the day that President Kennedy was assassinated, he gave a breakfast speech in Fort Worth, and he went back to his hotel to prepare for the flight from Fort Worth to Dallas for the motorcade. And one of the things he did prior to leaving for Dallas is he called John Nance Garner and wished him a happy 95th birthday. And so that will come into play next year. Okay? Okay, profile on Franklin D. Roosevelt. And you can follow through. You have the notes there. Add what you think you need to. Okay? Okay, Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882. He was born in Hyde Park, New York. He was the only child of James and Sarah Roosevelt. Both his parents came from very wealthy families, so he was what we call kind of a trust baby. He had a lot of money within his family, and he was an only child. His father, James, was 53 years old when he was born. That's pretty old to father a child. His mother was only 26, so there was quite an age difference between the two. Okay? Now, because of their wealth, Franklin Roosevelt was educated under private tutors until he was 14 years old. And at the age of 14, to no one's surprise, he entered a private school in Massachusetts and did very well academically, although he was very, very shy during that period of time and had very few close friends. He was kind of a mama's boy. We'll get to that a little bit later. Well, after graduating from a private high school in 1900, he enrolled at Harvard University. He was very bright. He majored in history. He graduated from Harvard in just 3 years. That's pretty impressive. And then he entered Columbia University Law School. Now, he began to court his distant cousin, Eleanor, while at Harvard, and the couple actually became engaged in 1903. In today's world, that would be a little weird. And in those days, a distant cousin, you could be far removed, probably wasn't looked at as badly, maybe, as it would be today. But he did begin to date his distant cousin, Eleanor, while at Harvard, and the couple became engaged in 1903. Now, as I mentioned, Franklin was a little bit of a mama's boy. When Franklin told his mother of his plans to marry Eleanor, his mother was very unhappy. She did not want another woman in his life. She was very possessive of her son. So she tried to change his mind about marriage, and she even took him on a Caribbean cruise, hoping that during the time together he'd forget about Eleanor and move on with his life. Well, despite her efforts, Franklin and Eleanor were married on March 17, 1905, and President Theodore Roosevelt actually gave away the bride, who was his niece. So there was a little bit of blood in there, distance, but they were related when they got married. Now, while the Roosevelts, this is really how you get to be an overbearing mother. While the Roosevelts were on their honeymoon, Franklin Roosevelt's mother took it upon herself to rent a house for the newlyweds. When they got back, they didn't pick their own house, and she furnished it completely to her taste. Now, that just doesn't seem like what you'd want, but that's what she did. Now, Eleanor was not happy about that. But, you know, there's no saying never get into a peeing match with a skunk, because even though you might get your licks in, you're going to smell like the skunk. And so rather than anger her new mother-in-law, though she wasn't happy, she simply accepted the arrangement and went on with life. During their marriage, the Roosevelts had 6 children. They had 5 boys and 1 girl. Franklin Delano Jr. died in infancy in 1909, while the remaining children lived through the decades of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, with their son James Roosevelt dying in 1991. So the blood marriage, so to speak, didn't make any difference in the life expectancy. Matter of fact, these people lived much longer than they probably should have. Now, getting back to Franklin Roosevelt, even though he passed his bar examination in 1907, he had very little interest in studying of law. So he left Columbia University Law School before he received his degree and decided to start a life in politics. And in 1910, he was elected to the United States Senate at just the age of 29. That's pretty young to be a senator. And he supported, believe it or not, Woodrow Wilson against his cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, in the 1912 presidential election. So he let party politics decide over family, which was kind of interesting. That's maybe a good attribute, if you're willing to feel that good about your convictions. Franklin Roosevelt was rewarded for his actions because President Wilson appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Who else held that position at one time? Theodore Roosevelt, interesting enough. And Roosevelt ran for the vice presidency in 1920, as we mentioned, with James M. Cox, but they were defeated by Warren Harding. After his loss for the vice presidency in 1920, Franklin Roosevelt returned to private life. And on August 9th of 1921, while he was at the family's summer home in Canada, Franklin Roosevelt fell into the water while sailing and became very chilled. And the next day, he felt very tired. He went swimming to refresh himself, but when he finished, he went back to the house feeling again very, very tired. The next morning, he noticed that neither of his legs were working properly, and by August 12th, he could not stand up or move his legs. In addition, he suffered severe pain. His arms and hands became partially paralyzed. He sought a medical opinion, and as a result of his symptoms, he was diagnosed with polio at the age of 39. Now that was kind of a dreadful disease to have at that time in history. Okay? Well, Roosevelt worked very hard. He put in years of grueling exercise and therapy to try and improve his condition. He did regain the use of his hands and later developed great strength in his arms and shoulders, and his legs improved a little bit, but he would never again walk without help or the use of leg braces. In 1928, he returned to politics. He was elected governor of New York. He was re-elected governor of New York in 1930, and by 1932, Franklin Roosevelt had set his sights on the presidency. He was elected President of the United States 4 times, this being the only man in American history to be elected to 4 terms, 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. However, on March 29, 1945, during his 4th term, he left the White House and traveled to Warm Springs, Georgia, for what he thought would be a restful vacation. On April 12, 1945, the president was planning to attend a barbecue that afternoon and was working at his desk while an artist painted his portrait. Suddenly he whispered, "I have a terrible headache," and fell over in his chair, and he died a few hours later of a cerebral hemorrhage. That would be bleeding on the brain. He was buried at Hyde Park, New York, where his remains stay today. So there's your profile on Theodore Roosevelt. Now, if you read the paper the other day, the newspaper reporter came in and talked to kids about the D.C. trip and the highlights of the trip and all that. And one of the students, I don't think that she mentioned in the article, stated that it was pretty cool to be there in D.C. on President Trump's 100th day in office. And this is where this comes from. It's kind of a little bit of a milestone in a presidency, okay? So that's what we mean by the 100 days. The Franklin Roosevelt family had barely moved into the White House after he was elected in 1932 when the new president plunged into action. During the first 3 months of his administration, he helped pass 15 different pieces of legislation. That is moving. And he needed to because our country was in tough shape. And all these laws were used to help fight every aspect of the Great Depression. Now, this period of time when the 15 laws were passed went down in history as the 100 days. And from that point on in American history, the first 3 months of a president's term is referred to as the 100 days. And that's what that girl was talking about. I think it was Taylor Nielsen maybe that stated that it was pretty cool to be in D.C. during the time that Trump had put in his 100th day in office, because they kind of give you an early evaluation of how well you're doing. Now, as I mentioned, it is generally stated that the American people can predict if a president is going to be successful by what he accomplished in those first 3 months. The jury is probably still out on President Trump. President Trump has his detractors and he has his supporters. And I don't, I got to be honest with you, I don't like to get into the politics that much, but I think right now you got about a 50-50 split in our country in support of Trump and non-support of Trump. And that probably makes sense when you look at the results of the election in which he won the electoral vote, but Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. I think you got about a 50-50 split. Most presidents would not care for a 50-50 split. They'd rather have a 60-40 or a 70-30. But that's kind of where I think we're at in the first 100 days. We'll know after that. Now, we're going to move on to something that's very important. And there are a lot of issues we had. And unemployment was a big, big issue when Roosevelt took office. Remember how many Americans were unemployed about the time he took office? Anybody remember? 12 million. That's a lot of people. And so the next subtopic then is New Deal measures to solve the issue of unemployment. And it was probably the most urgent task that faced President Roosevelt when he took office, because we had so many jobless, hungry Americans. It was unbelievable. And by the time he actually got involved, it went from 12 million to 14 million. So from the time that he was elected to the time he took office, another 2 million people were out of work in the United States. And his administration immediately launched a program of direct relief for Americans, and we're going to give you some examples of those. The first thing Congress passed during this time was called the Federal Emergency Relief Act, or FARA. And it distributed more than $3 billion to needy Americans. And this is kind of how that worked. This $3 billion was given to individual states. Each state got this money from the federal government. Then the state and local governments Now, it's the difference between a state government and local government. The state government of Wyoming is the state government. A local government would be the city of Worland, which has a mayor and council people. They're local. So what this did is this government money went to individual states. Some was given to be spent at the state level. Some was given to be spent at the local levels. And they were to use the money as they chose, either to give direct relief to people that were out of work or provide jobs. What is direct relief?
Just giving them the money.
Absolutely, Emily, just giving them the money. You know, you're hurting, here's some money. Providing jobs is using them. Okay, the difference is, if you give direct relief, as Emily said, you just hand Maddie, here Maddie, you're hurting, here's $1,000. Or you take that $1,000 and you go combine it with other thousands of dollars and you decide you're going to build or remodel a courthouse, and then you hire the people to do that. Those are kind of the options they have. Well, at one time, because of the Federal Emergency Relief Act, almost 8 million families in this country were on direct relief. What's another example of direct relief you might use now? When people go to, yeah, food stamps. When you go to the store and people have food coupons. Now, America was a proud country, and most families did not want direct relief. They would rather have had jobs. I wouldn't so necessarily say that might be the way it is today, because I talk to a lot of employers that can't get people to work because the direct relief is what? Too easy to get. That's a problem, I guess politically speaking, I think we have in this country. But at that time, most families didn't want a handout. They wanted jobs. So basically, after getting 8 million families on direct relief, the government made arrangements to move away from direct relief and move toward creating jobs. And to do that, in 1935, the Roosevelt administration created the Work Progress Administration, and they named a fellow by the name of Harry L. Hopkins as its director. And this Work Progress Administration received $6.3 billion in funds from Congress, and the program created jobs. And there's some examples we're going to go through of the type of jobs that the Work Progress Administration, under the leadership of Harry L. Hopkins, created. First of all, again, the government gave them $6.3 billion to do this. One area in which they created jobs is school construction. New schools were built or others repaired. So if you look at some of these older towns in Wyoming, I bet there was a lot of schools that were built in 1935, 36, 37, 38. Now you couldn't tell now they were new because it's been a long time, but it'd be amazing how many were built during that time. So they hired people to build new schools or repair ones that needed repairing. They also built sewage plants in 5,000 communities across the country. What's a sewage plant? When you guys flush your toilet and brush your teeth and all that, that water goes into the sewage area and ends up in an area where it's disposed of. A lot of towns across the country didn't have such a thing, so it just kind of went where it went. And so they decided, you know, it'd be nice to fix some of these communities up and have a sewage plant. And so they built 5,000 of those in communities across the country, which obviously employed people. Well, roads at that time in the 1930s weren't nice paved roads, and they maybe even the dirt roads weren't near as good as what we have today. So they put together a program where they built 128,000 miles of secondary roads. They either constructed, made new roads, or they improved the ones that were out there, because roads were not like they are today. So 128,000 miles of secondary roads. What's an example of a secondary road? You got one around Worland, Road 13, secondary road. The interstate is not a secondary road, and really the road that we drive from here to Billings isn't really a secondary road, but that road that goes off to Road 12 or Lane 17 or whatever, those are secondary roads. Well, by March of 1936, we had nearly 4 million Americans that were working for the WPA, which means a lot of people. Of the 12 million that were out of work, we had 4 million working for that organization doing those types of things. Now, this was a tough time in education because young Americans at this time were forced to leave school, which could be high school, my dad being one of those, or college because they lacked food and clothing or they were homeless. thousands of young Americans roamed the nation in search of work to survive. Now you guys got it pretty good because you're going to graduate next year, you're going to have this halfway money, and your parents probably aren't poor, you're going to probably all have an opportunity if you want to go to college. That wasn't the case. Now I'm going to tell you a little story about 8th grade graduation. Anybody know the history behind 8th grade graduation? They still go crazy over here on 8th grade graduation. Yeah. See, I'm not being critical of anybody. I'm just saying that is an old tradition, because when my dad grew up, because of things like the Depression, the farthest you went was 8th grade. Because what did you do then? Went and got a job because your family wasn't doing well, or you worked on the family farm. So 8th grade graduation in 1937 was a big deal. It's like graduating from high school now. And I always laugh when I see these 8th grade graduations that go over the top, in my opinion, because the reason you ever had an 8th grade graduation was because of what people did during this time following the Depression, because that's all the farther a lot of people went. So anyway, a lot of young people weren't going to college or even high school, they were working. 3 other agencies that were established to bring work to young Americans. These were totally for young Americans. The first one you've probably heard of, well maybe not, the Civilian Conservation Reforestation Act. And basically, this law would conserve our natural resources, and it put many Americans to work ensuring that that be done. Okay? How do you conserve natural resources? You ever go on your four-wheeler up in the mountains? How many have four-wheelers they travel on? Those trails you travel on, you know who puts those trails out? The Forest Service, right? Okay? That's really conservation of forests. It's allowing you to go there, but there's rules and regulations. They hire people to do that. So the Civilian Conservation Reforestation Act was a law that would conserve our natural resources and put many Americans